Mercury Steam set out to reimagine the Castlevania series with its first outing, Castlevania Lords of Shadow. They set the bar high for themselves. A 3D Castlevania game that actually understood what it means to be a classic-style Castlevania game in the vein of the first few NES titles. But here in Lords of Shadow 2, what made the original game so fun and good is gone, and in its place is a story that's not as interesting and very difficult to follow, and an open world that's no fun to traverse. But hey, the combat is still good. To put it simply, Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 is the perfect example of a dropped ball.
What is a man? But a miserable pile of secrets.
When the game opens, you're greeted to a somewhat familiar face in Gabriel Belmont, the protagonist of the previous title. But this time his complexion seems to have lost some color and has a craving for human blood. The tone set during this part of the game is unbelievably good. Gabriel, now Dracula, fights against holy soldiers whom currently attempting to sack Castle Dracula. But this event ends and is preceded by extremely long cutscenes and flashbacks, after which Dracula is dropped into a modern setting. It's at this point in time in which the story becomes almost incoherent, switching between a modern setting and what seem to be hallucinations or maybe time travel back to the castle. The confusion in the storytelling kept the plot from really being able to flesh itself out. The game throws somewhat familiar faces from the previous title as well as previous Castlevania games into the mix that do help move the story along, even if it is super hard to follow. But getting to them can be difficult when the world you're playing in is not fun to move around in.
God is with me, monster.
That will be your ruin.
Unlike the level-based travel from Lords of Shadow 2 attempts to make an open world similar to one of its predecessors, Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. And much like Simon's Quest, getting from place to place can be very difficult. Dracula can't run very fast and he's not the best climber, and it turns out those are the only two forms of travel at Dracula's disposal. I found myself dashing from place to place in an effort to speed up travel, especially when I would find myself in large rooms with no enemies for periods of time. But when I finally found some enemies, the game proved to me that combat is king. Dracula's Blood Whip is his main weapon, and acts much like the Combat Cross from the first game. So much so that most combos from Lords of Shadow transfer over to Lords of Shadow 2. And just like the first game's light and dark magic, this game features Void and Chaos. When fighting with Void, Dracula gets his health back for every time he strikes an enemy, and when fighting with Chaos, he can break armor and does more damage. The combat has a ton of depth as a result from these simple options, though the enemies he ends up fighting aren't that interesting. For example, armored suited jetpack guys with guns on stilts, or demons in tattered clothing with shotguns. They just don't seem to fit in this Castlevania's modern setting, or any Castlevania setting for that matter. I'm not gonna say I didn't have fun playing Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2, but I was supremely disappointed with its awkward storytelling, its uninteresting setting, and its poor enemy design. Here's hoping the next Castlevania is 2D. Everyone seems to love those games. Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 gets a 6.5 out of 10.